When working in Force.com, you're going to hear the term organization, or org, a lot. So what is an organization? From a business perspective, an organization is that unit that is licensed. In other words, you have to have a user license for each user on an organization. From a software perspective, an organization is a unit of isolation. The idea of isolation is fundamental in computer science. We're all familiar with the idea of process isolation. Any multitasking operating system, such as Windows and Linux, provides isolation between processes so that each process cannot interfere with the others. .NET developers are also familiar with the idea of app domain isolation, where multiple applications can coexist within the same process and not interfere with each other. This is commonly used, for example, in IIS, where a single web service process can handle multiple requests, multiple applications at once. In Force.com, you have isolation by organization. Each organization on the multi-tenanted cloud has its own database objects, its own configuration, its own information, and all of the applications within an organization can share that data and can access that data. So in fact, on Force.com, the organization is the fundamental unit of isolation. As software developers, we usually think about isolation in terms of access to memory by applications. But on Force.com, it's a lot more than that. We're concerned about access to objects, database objects on the native database in Force.com, the fields on the objects, page layouts, validation rules, workflows, which are ways to execute operations without code, reports, email templates, pages, Visual Force pages, which allows Force.com to expose web pages, code, triggers and classes, security settings, and so on. All of this data that defines an organization is visible to all of the applications in an org, and it comprises what we call the metadata of an organization. Metadata is a term we're going to use a lot when talking about Force.com. Perhaps the first thing every Apex developer learns about coding on Force.com is this fact. You can never edit code on a production org. You can only deploy it from a development org or a sandbox org, and you can only do so if you have sufficient unit test coverage to cover 75% of the code. As a result, Force.com is probably the only platform where every piece of code in production has unit tests. Some of them are even good. We'll talk more about how to deploy code from development and sandbox orgs into production later in this course. I'd like to share with you two thoughts before we dive in and look at the development environment itself. First of all, remember that previous slide where code was just one of the items of metadata on the list? That's important because an application in Salesforce consists of a lot more than just code. As developers, we tend to be very code-centric, but code is just one aspect of software development under Force.com. Second, you may have noticed that I only talk about Force.com. What about Salesforce? Well, it turns out that Salesforce is just another application that runs on the Force.com platform. True, it's the biggest application, it's a native application, and it's the most popular application, but it is still just an application on Force.com. And because every application in an organization has access to the same data, when you write an application for Force.com, you could write it just for Force.com, or you could write it specifically as an add-in to the Salesforce application.